I don't know what time it is, so you have the time? Yeah. 6:04. Oh, we are perfect time. Ciao, Anissa. Going? I'm just going to introduce you and then the movie and then.
All right. So I'll sit over there.
Yeah, excellent. All right. I don't think I need this, but. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, people, good evening. We are here for the second lecture, or if we want to see debate, of the series of Understanding Mass Violence that we have started approximately 1 month ago with an introductory lecture by Professor Abram de Swaan. We don't need to introduce Abram de Swaan as well again, but I just want to say a few words, saying that Professor de Swaan is a specialist in the field. He has written a number of books on the topic, and so, you know, he has come to share with us the knowledge that he has built during his research in this particular field. Now, as I anticipated to you, at least to those who are in my classes, tonight, because we are talking about the perpetrator, I have created a sort of compilation of perpetrators in the act of perpetrating, which I will open this session with. It may be confronting for some of you, so I have told any of my students that feel that is too much, want to leave and want to come back when Abram then discusses the topic, please do so. Okay, feel free to do so. The footage starts with a account from a book that you all know because it's one of the readings for our course, Ordinary Men by Browning. And I wish to thank officially one of the AOC students, Matthew, for who is a mother language English speaker, for reading out loud and recording himself for our lecture tonight. The first footage requires you just to listen. I didn't want you to be confronted with images in the beginning, so the first footage is just listen, and then we will pass on to image. I tried to cover a number of different situations that fall under the understanding of genocide. Yeah, I'm not exhaustive. I can't be exhaustive. There may be more that have been classified as genocide or not, that may fall under the definition of the Genocide Convention or not, which we know the Genocide Convention is quite restrictive in its definition, possible genocide, excluding certain type of situation. So this is important to understand that I don't mean to be exhaustive. I just try to present you some types of perpetrator, and Abram will then expand our knowledge on that. Okay? I now have to put a password. And we are ready to screen. Okay? Yes. Okay.
It was probably on July 11th, Glover or someone on the staff contacted Major Travel and informed him that the Israeli Police Battalion 101 had basket rounding up to 1,800 Jews in Joseph, a village about 30 kilometers slightly south and east of the village. This time, however, most of the Jews were not to be relocated. Only the male Jews of working age were to be sent to one of Governor's camps in Lublin. The women, children, and elderly simply to be shot on the spot. Trapp recalled the units that were stationed in nearby towns. The battalion reassembled in Belgrade on July 12, with 2 exceptions. The 3rd Platoon, 3rd Company, including Captain Hoffman, stationed in Johor, as well as a few men of 1st Company already stationed in Joseph. Trapp met with 1st and 2nd Company commanders, Captain Wolof and Lieutenant, and informed them of the next day's task. Trapp's adjutant, 1st Lieutenant Harden, must have informed other officers of the battalion. Lieutenant Heinz Butchman learned from him the precise details of the pending action. Butchman, then 38 years old, was the head of a family number business in Hamburg. He had joined the Nazi Party in May 1937, drafted into the Order Police in 1939. He had served as a driver in Poland. In the summer of 1940, he applied for a discharge. Instead, he was sent to officer training and commissioned as a reserve lieutenant in November 1941. He was given command of the 1st Platoon of 1st Company in 19. Upon learning of the imminent massacre, Bushman made clear to Hagen that as a Hamburg businessman, served lieutenant, he would, quote, in no case participate in such an action in which defenseless women and children were shot. He asked for another assignment. Hagen arranged for Bushman to be in charge of the escort of the male work Jews who were to be selected and taken to London. His company captain, Wolof, was informed of Bushman's assignment, but not the reason for it. The men were not officially informed, other than that they would be awakened in the early morning for a major action involving the entire battalion. But some had at least a hint of what was to come. Captain Wolof told a group of his men that an extremely interesting task awaited them the next day. Another man who complained that he was being left behind to guard the barracks was told by his company adjutant, "Be happy that you don't have to come. You'll see what happens." Sergeant Heinrich Stinsmitz warned his men of 3rd Platoon, 2nd Company, that he didn't want to see any cowards. Additional ammunition was given out. One policeman reported that his unit was given whips, which led to rumors of a shooting match. No one else, however, remembered whips. Departing from Belcherage around 2 a.m., the truck convoy arrived in Josephine just as the sky was beginning to light. Trapp assembled the men in a half circle and addressed them. After explaining the battalion's murderous assignment, he made his extraordinary offer. Any of the older men who did not feel up to the task that lay before them could step out. Trapp paused, and after some moments, one man from 3rd Company, Otto Julius Schmidt, stepped forward. Captain Hoffman, who had arrived in Josephine directly from Stockholm with the 3rd Platoon, 3rd Company, and had not been part of the officers' meeting in Bridge-Rise the day before, was furious that one of his men had been the first to break ranks. Hoffman began to berate Schmidt, but Trapp cut him off. After he had taken Schmidt under his protection, some 10 or 12 other men stepped forward as well. They turned in their rifles and were told to await a further assignment from them. Trapp then summoned the company commanders and gave them their respective assignments. The orders were relayed by 1st Sergeant Kammer to 1st Company and by Naden Hoffman to 2nd and 3rd Company. 2 platoons of 3rd Company were to surround the village. The men were explicitly ordered to shoot anyone trying to escape. The remaining men were to round up the Jews and take them to the marketplace. Those too sick or frail to walk to the marketplace, as well as infants and anyone offering resistance or attempting to hide, were to be shot on the spot. Thereafter, a few men of 1st Company were to escort the work Jews who had been selected at the marketplace, while the rest of 1st Company was to proceed to the forest to form the firing squads. The Jews were to be loaded onto the battalion trucks by 2nd Company and 3rd Platoon of 3rd Company and shuttled from the marketplace to the forest. After making the assignments, Trapp spent most of the day in town, either in a schoolroom converted into his headquarters, at home to the Polish mayor and the local priest, at the marketplace, or on the road to the forest. But he did not go to the forest itself, or witness the executions. His absence there was conspicuous. As one policeman bitterly commented, Major Trapp was never there. Instead, he remained in Josephine because he allegedly could not bear the sight. We men were upset about that, and said we couldn't bear it either. Indeed, Trapp's distress was a secret to no one. At the marketplace, one policeman remembered hearing Trapp say, "Oh God, why did I have to be given these orders?" as he put his hand on his heart. Another policeman witnessed him at the schoolhouse. Today, I can still see exactly before my eyes Major Trapp there in the room, pacing back and forth with his hands behind his back. He made a downcast impression and spoke to me. He said something like, "Man, such jobs don't suit me, but orders are orders." Another man remembered vividly how Trapp, finally alone in our room, sat on a stool and wept bitterly. The tears really flowed. Another also witnessed Trapp at his headquarters. Major Trapp ran around excitedly and then suddenly stopped dead in front of me, stared and asked if I agreed with this. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "No, Herr Major," then began to run around again and wept like a child. The doctor's aide encountered Trapp weeping on the path from the marketplace to the forest and asked if he could help. He answered me only to the effect that everything was really terrible. Concerning Joseph, Trapp later confided to his driver, "If this Jewish business is ever avenged on earth, then have mercy on us Germans." While Trapp complained of his orders and wept, his men proceeded to carry out the battalion's task. The non-commissioned officers divided some of their men into search teams of 2, 3, or 4, and sent them into Jewish sections of Joseph. Other men were assigned as guards along the streets leading to the marketplace, or at the marketplace itself. As the Jews were driven out of their houses and the immobile was shot, the air was filled with screams and gunfire. As one policeman noted, it was a small town and they could hear everything. Many policemen admitted seeing the corpses of those who'd been shot during the search, but only 2 admitted having shot. Again, several policemen admitted having heard that all the patients in the Jewish hospital or Old People's Home had been shot on the spot, though no one admitted having actually seen the shooting taking part. The witnesses were least agreed on the question of how the men initially reacted to the problem of shooting infants. Some claimed that along with the elderly and sick, infants were among those shot and left lying in the houses, doorways, and streets of the town. Others, however, stressed quite specifically that in this initial action, the men still shied away from shooting infants during the search and clearing operation. One policeman was emphatic, but among the Jews shot in our section of town, there was no infants or small children. I should like to say that almost tacitly, everyone refrained from shooting infants and small children. And Joseph hours later, he observed, even in the face of death, the Jewish mothers did not separate from their children. Thus, we tolerated the mothers taking their small children to the marketplace in Joseph's. Another policeman likewise noted that tacitly the shooting of infants and small children was avoided by almost all the men involved. During the entire morning, I was able to observe that when being taken away, many women carried infants in their arms and led small children by the hand. According to both witnesses, none of the officers intervened when infants were brought to the marketplace. Another policeman, however, recalled that after the clearing operation, his unit, 3rd Platoon, 3rd Company, was reproached by Captain Hoffman. We had not proceeded energetically enough. As the roundup neared completion, the men of 1st Company were withdrawn from the search and given a quick lesson in the gruesome task that awaited them. They were instructed by the battalion doctor and company's 1st sergeant, one musically inclined policeman who frequently played the violin on special evenings, along with the doctor who played a wonderful accordion, recalled, "I believe that at this point all officers of the battalion were present, especially our battalion physician, Dr. Schoenfelder. He now had to explain to us precisely how we had to shoot in order to induce the immediate death of the victim. I remember exactly, for this demonstration he drew or outlined the contour of a human body, at least from the shoulders upward, and then indicated precisely the point on which he fixed the bayonet was to be placed as an aiming gun. After 1st Company had received instructions and departed for the woods, Trapp's adjutant, Hagen, presided over the selection of the work Jews. The head of a nearby sawmill had already approached Trapp with a list of 25 Jews who worked for him, and Trapp had permitted their release. The old interpreter Hagen now called for craftsmen and able-bodied male workers. There was unrest as some 300 workers were separated from their families. Before they had been marched out to Joseph on foot, first shots from the woods were heard. After the first salvos, a grave unrest grew among these craftsmen, and some of the men threw themselves upon the ground weeping. It had to have become clear to them at this point that the families they had left behind were being shot. And the Luxembourgers in 1st Company marched the workers a few kilometers to a country loading station on the rail line. Several train cars, including a passenger car, were waiting. The work Jews and their guards were then taken by train to London, where Bushman delivered them to a camp. According to Bushman, he did not put them in the notorious concentration camp on Majdanek, but in another camp instead. The Jews were not expected, he said, but the camp administration was about to take them. Bushman and his men would return to Gilgeorge the same day. Meanwhile, 1st Sergeant Kammer had taken the initial contingent of shooters in 1st Company to a forest several kilometers from Joseph. The trucks halted on a dirt road that ran along the edge, at a point where a pathway led into the woods. The men climbed down from their trucks and waited. When the first truckload of 35 to 40 Jews arrived, an equal number of policemen came forward and face to face were paired off with their victims. Led by Kama, the policemen and Jews marched down the forest path. He turned off into the woods at a point indicated by Captain Wallow, who busied himself throughout the day selecting the execution sites. Kama then ordered the Jews to lie down in a row. The policemen stepped up behind them, placed their bayonets on the backbone above the shoulder blades as earlier instructed, and on Kama's orders, fired in unison. In the meantime, more policemen of First Company had arrived at the edge of the forest to fill out a second firing squad. As the first firing squad marched out of the woods to the unloading point, the second group took their victims along the same path into the woods. Wolof chose a site a few yards further on so the next batch of victims would not see the corpses from the earlier execution. These Jews were again forced to lie down in a row, and the shooting procedure was repeated. Thereafter, the pendulum traffic of the two firing squads in and out of the woods continued throughout the day, except for a midday break. The shooting proceeded without interruption until nightfall. At some point in the afternoon, someone organized a supply of alcohol for the shooters. By the end of the day of nearly continuous shooting, the men had completely lost track of how many Jews they had killed. In the words of one policeman, it was in any case a great number. When Trapp first made his offer early in the morning, the real nature of the action had just been announced, and time to think and react had been very short. Only a dozen men had instinctively seized the moment to step out, turning their rifles and thus excuse themselves from the subsequent thing. For many, the reality of what they were about to do, and particularly that they themselves might be chosen for the firing squad, probably not sunk in. But when the men of First Company were summoned to the marketplace, instructed in giving a neck shot, and sent to the woods to kill Jews, some of them tried to make up for the opportunity they had missed earlier. One policeman approached First Simon Buchanan, whom he knew well. He confessed that the task was repugnant to him and asked for a different assignment. Hammer obliged, assigning him to guard duty on the edge of the forest, where he remained throughout the day. Several other policemen who knew Kama well were given guard duty along the truck route. After shooting for some time, another group of policemen approached Kama and said they could not continue. He released them from the firing squad and reassigned them to accompany the trucks. Two policemen made the mistake of approaching Captain Wolof instead of Kama. They pleaded that they too were fathers with children and they could not continue. Wolof curtly refused them, indicating they could lie down alongside the victims. At the midday pause, however, Kama relieved not only these two men, but a number of other older men as well. They were sent back to the marketplace, accompanied by a non-commissioned officer who reported to Trapp. Trapp dismissed them from further duty and permitted them to return earlier to the barracks in Bilgeraj. Some policemen who did not request to be released from the firing squads sought other ways to evade. Non-commissioned officers armed with submachine guns had to be assigned to give so-called mercy shots, quote, because both from the excitement as well as intentionally, individual policemen shot past their victims. Others had taken evasive action earlier. During the clearing operation, some men of First Company hid in the Catholic priest's garden until they grew afraid that their absence would be noticed. Returning to the marketplace, they jumped aboard a truck that was going to pick up Jews from a nearby village in order to have an excuse for their absence. Others hung around the marketplace because they did not want to round up Jews during the search. Still others spent as much time as possible searching the houses so as not to be present at the marketplace, where they feared being assigned to a firing squad. A driver assigned to take Jews to the forest made only one trip before he asked to be relieved. Presumably, his nerves were not strong enough to drive more Jews to the shooting site, commented the man who had taken over his truck and his duties of chauffeuring Jews to their death. After the men of First Company departed for the woods, Second Company was left to complete the roundup and load Jews onto the trucks. When the first salvo was heard from the woods, a terrible cry swept the marketplace as the collected Jews realized their fate. Thereafter, however, a quiet composure, indeed, in the words of a German witness, an unbelievable and astonishing settled over the Jews. He divided his company into two groups assigned to different sections of the woods. He then visited Bolog's First Company to witness a demonstration of the executions. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Shea and Sergeant Helger told the first platoon of Second Company, along with some men of Third Platoon, to a certain point in the woods. Shea divided his men into four groups, assigned them each a shooting area, and sent them back to fetch the Jews they were to kill. Lieutenant Nade arrived and heatedly argued with Shea that the men were not being sent deep enough into the woods. By the time each group had made 2 or 3 round trips to the collection point and carried out their executions, it was clear that Shea that the process was too slow. He asked Hergo for advice. I then made the proposal, Hergo recalled, that it would suffice if the Jews were brought from the collection point to the place of execution by only 2 men of each group, while the other shooters of the execution commando would already have moved to the next shooting site. Furthermore, the shooting site was moved somewhat forward from execution to execution, and thus always got closer to the collection point on the forest. We then proceeded accordingly. Hergo's suggestion speeded the killing process considerably. Hergo was emphatic that no one in first platoon was given the option of withdrawing beforehand. But once the executions began and men approached either him or Shea because they could not shoot women and children, they were given other duties. This was confirmed by one of his men. During the execution, word spread that anyone who could not take it any longer could report. He went on to note, I myself took part in some 10 shootings, in which I had to shoot men and women. I simply could not shoot at people anymore, which became apparent to my sergeant Hergo because at the end I repeatedly shot past. For this reason, he relieved me. Other comrades were also relieved sooner or later, because they simply could no longer continue. When dividing his men into small groups of shooters, Drucker had kept about a third of them in reserve. Ultimately, everyone was to shoot, but the idea was to allow frequent relief and cigarette breaks. With the constant coming and going of the trucks, the wild terrain and frequent rotation, men did not remain in fixed groups. The confusion created the opportunity for work slowdown and evasion. Some men who hurried at their tasks shot far more Jews than others who delayed as much as they could. After 2 rounds, one policeman simply slipped off and stayed among the trucks on the edge of the forest. Another managed to avoid taking his turn with the shooters altogether. It was in no way the case that those who did not want to or could not carry out the shooting of human beings with their own hands could not keep themselves out of the task. No strict control was being carried out of them. I therefore remained by the arriving trucks and kept myself busy at the arrival point. In any case, I gave my activity such an appearance. It could not be avoided that one or another of my comrades had noticed that I was not going to the executions to fire away at the victims. They showered me with remarks such as shithead and weakling, expressed their disgust, but I suffered no consequences for my actions. I must mention here that I was not the only one who kept himself out of participation in the executions. By far, the largest number of shooters at Joseph Howe who were interrogated after the war came from the 3rd Platoon of 2nd Company. It is from them that we can perhaps get the best impression of the effect of the executions on the men and the dropout rate among them during the course of the action. Hans Dettelmann, a 40-year-old barber who was assigned by Drucker to the firing squad. It was still not possible for me to shoot the first victim at the first execution, and I wandered off and asked Lieutenant Drucker to be relieved. Dettelmann told his lieutenant that he had a very weak nature. Drucker let him go. Walters Niehaus, a former Ritzman cigarette sales representative, was paired with an elderly lady for the first round. After I shot the elderly woman, I went to Tony Bentheim, his sergeant, and told him that I was not able to carry out further executions. I did not have to participate in the shootings anymore. My nerves were totally finished from this one shooting. George Cayley, a 37-year-old tailor, made it through the first round before encountering the report. After I carried out the first shooting and at the unloading point was allotted a mother with daughter as victims for the next shooting, I began a conversation with them and learned that they were Germans from Kassel. I took the decision not to participate further in the executions. The entire business was now so repugnant to me that I returned to my platoon leader and told him that I was still sick and asked for my release. Kegler was sent to guard the marketplace. Neither his pre-execution conversation with his victim nor his discovery that there were German Jews in Joseph Howe's unit. Schimke, the man who had first stepped out, encountered a Jew from Hamburg in the marketplace, as did a second policeman. Yet another policeman remembered the first Jew he shot was a decorated World War I veteran from Bremen who had begged in vain for mercy. Franz Kostenbaum, who during his official interrogation had denied remembering anything about the killing of Jews in Poland, suddenly appeared uninvited at the office of the Hamburg State Prosecutor investigating Reserve Police Battalion 101. He told that he had been a member of a firing squad of 7 or 8 men taking its victims to the woods and shot them in the neck at point blank range. This procedure had been repeated until the fourth victim. He had come to make a statement. He explained to the investigating attorney because he had no peace since attempting to conceal the shooting action. Most of those who found the shooting impossible to bear quit very early, but not always. The men in one squad had already shot 10 to 20 Jews each when they finally asked to be relieved. As one of them explained, I especially asked them to be relieved because the men next to me shot so impossibly. As with first company, alcohol was made available to the policemen and the Drucker and Steinmetz who stayed in the forest and continued shooting. As darkness approached at the end of a long summer day and the murderous task was still not finished, the shooting became even less organized and more hectic. The forest was so full of dead bodies that it was difficult to find places to make the Jews lie down. When darkness finally fell about 9 p.m., some 17 hours after Reserve Police Battalion 101 had first arrived on the outskirts of Joseph and the last Jews had been killed, men returned to the marketplace and prepared to depart for Belgorod. No plans had been made for the burial of the bodies, and the dead Jews were simply left lying in the woods. Neither clothing nor valuables had been officially collected, but at some point, at least some of the policemen had enriched themselves with watches, jewelry, and money taken from the victims. The pile of luggage the Jews had been forced to leave at the marketplace was simply burned. Before the policemen climbed into their trucks and left Joseph, a 10-year-old girl appeared, bleeding from the head. She was brought to Trapp, who took her in his arms and said, "You shall remain alive." When the men arrived at the barracks in Belgorod, they were depressed, angered, embittered, and shaken. They ate little but drank heavily. Generous quantities of alcohol were provided, and many of the policemen got quite drunk. Major Trapp made the rounds, trying to console and reassure them, and again placing responsibility on higher authorities. But neither the drink nor Trapp's consolation could wash away the sense of shame and horror that pervaded the barracks. Trapp asked the men not to talk about it, but they needed no encouragement in that direction. Those who had not been in the forest did not want to learn more. Those who had been there likewise had no desire to speak, either then or later. By silent consensus within Reserve Battalion 101, the Joseph massacre was simply not discussed. The entire matter was a taboo, but repression during waking hours could not stop the nightmares. During the first night back from Joseph, one policeman awoke firing a scope into the ceiling of the barracks. The guest told me the other day, somebody that played on a work detail outside the wire, learned that everybody from the missing friends had shot the man to the left of the SP, the man to the right. He walked on the line shooting at the man with a pistol. Go ahead, go on, leave.
In ISIS's plans and its propaganda, its leaders seek to prove they're in it for the long haul, building a so-called state that will last centuries. And that's where children come in. They call them the cubs of the caliphate.
This is a family job. So you bring over your wife, your children, your babies. released a video in 2013 where they would guest at a house that housed 150 members of family from Kazakhstan. Big family, fathers, mothers, cousins, daughters, and so on.
And then you've got the video introduces a Kazakh youngster named Abdullah, seated alongside his father.
We see this young, very innocent child brought into this conflict in Syria, and from the lens of ISIS, he's going to become a hub of the caliphate.
Over the next year and a half, videos track his progression.
Characters who are essentially the cubs, the 16 and younger individuals. He is featured in that video. He is learning how to fight, how to conduct martial arts, how to gain physical agility, but also how to use weapons, how to dismantle and assemble AK-47s and so on. And in the video, he reiterates what ISIS message has originally been, which we're going to come for the infidels.
January 13th, 2015, ISIS releases a third video featuring the Kazakh boy.
Approximately 5 months later, we see him in a video with another individual, an adult, like his mentor. This is the culmination of these three videos. He came as a newcomer, he was a nobody. He later trained, went through their training camp, learned their ideology, learned their way of life, adopted their beliefs. In this third video, we see two individuals who are alleged Russian spies. These two alleged informants, they are kneeling down.
The video gets graphic. We will not show you the shoot.
You don't see any kind of facial expressions on his face. You don't see any expressions of being taken aback. We see Abdullah kind of slowly approaching those two individuals.
And the child is very calm and very confident at what he's about to do. And he reverses the gun as soon as he can handle it with intention and purpose.
The two alleged spies are killed. In less than a year and a half, Abdullah has gone from a kid to an execution. The more ISIS is able to control schools in Syria and Iraq, the more this indoctrination becomes possible.
It's absolutely a type of brainwashing, and it's absolutely effective brainwashing. Once they pull the trigger, they can't go back.
The global recruitment and military use of children under the age of 15 has been labeled a war crime by the UN Human Rights Council. And Abdullah isn't the only one. As of September 2015, there have been nearly 30 child executioners documented in ISIS propaganda. The jihadis are trying to cultivate the next generation.
ISIS is impressive what's been able to accomplish. It's not going to be tall either.
The extremist Hutu leadership implemented the next phase of its plan to spread the killing across the nation by exploiting Rwanda's culture of obedience. They told Hutus the Tutsi rebels were foreign invaders bent on turning them into slaves. Their propaganda reminded Hutus that the Tutsis had ruled them for centuries, often treating them with disdain.
Tutsi is used to abuse Hutus. For example, if a Tutsi chief wished to stand up from his chair, he would call him a Hutu, who would allow his foot to be pierced by the Tutsi's spear as it flew down. My understanding is that Tutsis are not originally from Rwanda. They heard that they might have come from Egypt or somewhere else.
Extremist hate radio station told Hutus to eliminate their Tutsi neighbors.
Then, when the war began, people changed. One day across the valley, we saw houses burning and people fleeing from their homes.
parents into the Catholic Church in Nyirabuye, where along with more than 5,000 other Tutsis, they waited. It was April the 15th.
I was a young girl. My parents thought the church was safe because no one would be killed in the church. When we arrived, I could see the older people were very sad and upset. Everybody was scared, but nobody knew what was going to happen.
The leader of the local community told us that Tutsis had fled the army and they were to go there and kill them. On the morning of April 15th, we woke up and started walking towards the church. It was like going to the marketplace.
I saw the soldiers come in and they started shooting and shooting. All we had to defend ourselves were rocks. Then our local governor, the Chimbusi, came in and stood in front of us. The Chimbusi said that everyone should know what they were there for. He said that all those who were there should be killed, that no one should survive. Then they started killing, hacking with their machetes. They kept doing it, and I was hiding on dead people. They didn't kill me because of the blood covering me. They thought they had killed me.
It was as if we were taken over by Satan. When Satan is using you, you lose your mind. We were not ourselves. You couldn't be normal and you started butchering people for no reason. We had been attacked by the devil.
Each day, Gromo Alex delivered food to refugees at UN safe havens in the city and learned to navigate the Interahamwe roadblocks.
Started as early as we could in the morning, not too early. We tried to finish it as early in the afternoon as possible. So that by noon, they had been drinking and were intoxicated. And they had either killed people and wanted to kill more, or they hadn't killed and they wanted to kill. Like a drink, that if you took one drink, you wanted another one, you wanted another, you wanted to become more and more intoxicated. Sometimes people kill once, and then to lessen the impact of that murder on their psyches or on their conscience, they kill again, and then they kill again, and then each murder drives you to kill again, and not so much that you forget that you killed before, but that you've killed, and it just becomes part of you. You've just got to kill.
Your Honours, I am grateful to you for granting me leave to address you today. On the territory of the country in which I was born, shooting from firearms was usual when celebrating the birth of a male child. These shots tell you everything, what a new male member of the family means and what is expected of him. Strength, protection, he should be a warrior, a soldier, the head of the family, as they say in our parts. Unfortunately, when other kinds of shooting started in the former Yugoslavia, shooting in war, it was normal for every man, every male child, to put on a uniform, take up a weapon, and go to protect his homeland, his nation, and ultimately his family. This was expected of him. This was his role. A sacred role. There was no choice. You could be either a traitor or a traitor. At the beginning of the war, it seemed as if the war and all it brought with it was impossible, that this wasn't really happening to us, and that everything would be resolved within a few days, and that finally our generation would have a chance. We didn't even notice how we were drawn into the vortex of interethnic hatred, and how neighbors were no longer able to live beside each other. Surrounded with horrors, we got used to them and went on living like that. Among those horrors, things happened that were done by people who knew each other. People who until yesterday had lived almost as family members together. In Bosnia, a neighbor means more than a relative. In Bosnia, having coffee with your neighbor is a ritual. And this is what we trampled on and forgot. We lost ourselves in hatred and brutality. And in this vortex of terrible misfortune and horror, the horror of Srebrenica happened.
Mr. President, Your Honours, Madam Prosecutor Counsel, I'm thankful to have this opportunity to speak today. Nearly 2 years ago, I came before this tribunal having been charged with participating in crimes against other human beings and even against humanity itself. I came for two reasons: to confront these charges and to spare my people, for it was clear that they would pay the price of any refusal to come. I have now had time to examine these charges and, together with my lawyers, conduct our own investigation and evaluation. I have now come to the belief and accept the fact that many thousands of innocent people were the victims of an organized, systematic effort to remove Muslims and Croats from the territory claimed by Serbs. At the time, I easily convinced myself that this was a matter of survival and self-defense. In fact, it was more. Our leadership, of which I was a necessary part, led an effort which victimized countless innocent people. Explanations of self-defense and survival offer no justification. By the end, it was said, even among our own people, that in this war, we had lost our nobility of character. The obvious questions become, if this truth is now self-evident, why did I not see it earlier? And how could our leaders and those who followed have committed such acts? The answer to both questions is, I believe, fear. A blinding fear that led to an obsession, especially for those of us for whom the Second World War was living memory, that Serbs would never again allow themselves to become victims. In this, we in the leadership violated the most basic duty of every human being, the duty to restrain oneself and to respect the human dignity of others. We were committed to do whatever was necessary to prevail. Although I was repeatedly informed of allegations of cruel and inhuman conduct against non-Serbs, I refused to accept them or even to investigate. In fact, I immersed myself in addressing the suffering of the war's innocent Serb victims. This daily work confirmed in my mind that we were in a struggle for our very survival, and that in this struggle, the international community was our enemy. And so I simply denied these charges, making no effort to investigate. I remain secure in my belief that Serbs were not capable of such acts. In this obsession of ours to never again become victims, we had allowed ourselves to become victimizers.
On November 29, 1864, a unit of cavalry numbering 900 men surrounded a peaceful Cheyenne village in Sand Creek, Colorado. The Indians raised the American flag, and the white flag was surrendered. They're coming out. Such. I think it's part of his work. My God, sir, he's got a flag of truce. Yes, sir, it's a white flag nonsense. We just told you I can't take the order. And what did you do? Yes.
Brave lad coming out here to kill himself, a real live Injun, putting up their forts in a country they got no claim to. So what the Indians do? Sit on their butts while the army took over their land.
You saw for yourself what they did, taking off scouts.
Yeah, who taught them that little trick? The white man there, cutting up hands and cutting up feet and cutting up. I never get cut off, but at least they don't make tobacco pouches out of them. That's something else you soldier boys made up. A prayer, soldier blue. Nice poem. Say something pretty.
General Nelson A. Mines, new chief of staff. And the Sand Creek massacre, the foulest and most unjust crime in American history.
Okay, this ends our screening. Okay. And I would say that we take a 10-minute recess, and then we come back and discuss this with Abram. Okay? Yes. Yes. So, he's sitting here.
Okay.
Okay, guys.
Good
Let's hear
evening.
from Abram.
I think we're ready for the
Let's hear
second
from Abram.
part. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. I'm probably, like many of you are, quite upset. What you have seen, you have listened to the reading of a part of Christopher Browning's book on Police Battalion 101 at Josefov. This was bad. It gets much worse as the book continues, incredibly bad. And then you saw some mostly fictionalized footage, except for the ISIS, because ISIS was very proud of its deeds and liked to show it to the world. And there you see probably also very, in a way, fictionalized in an ISIS frame. Where does that leave us? Basically, it leaves me a little bit trembling on my feet, and I feel like staying for a few seconds by what it does to you, because that is part of what it's all about. You can also be silent. Even I can be silent. Maybe I should be silent for a few seconds. We don't always have to talk. Yeah. We're in a spot. I saw this sort of stuff for years and years, and by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I would go to sleep for a while. And after I finished the book, I decided that I never wanted to see anything of it again. So a little bit against my principles, I kept my eyes open. There's so much which you can take, and you don't have to take it. What upsets you probably also must have been somewhere in the mind of these murderers, but they, one way or another, managed to overcome it. And how they did that, and whether such feelings were at all in their mind, that's what I'll try to encircle, make circles around it and see if we can come any closer. Because I want to talk about the perpetrators, people who do this, like the people in Police Battalion 101, and like the SS man, that was Schindler's movie, Schindler's List, right? Yeah. What kind of people were these mass murderers, or what makes them do it? That is what's on your minds, because it is rather far from your daily occupations. The most generally accepted answer, what kind of people these are, is they are ordinary people. That's even the title of Christopher Browning's book, Ordinary Men. I should add, these are mostly men. In the vast majority are men. We'll come to talk about why that should be, but that's the case. And then usually somewhere in the first chapter or in the last, it will say, ordinary people like you and me, assuming that you and I are ordinary people. And generally, you don't think of yourself as an ordinary, you find yourself rather extraordinary. Nobody else inhabits this body. It's quite unique. So ordinary people like you and me. Come to think of it, what the hell does ordinary people mean? Well, in the rhetoric of this argument, which is very, very widespread in Holocaust and genocide studies about ordinary people, it means that they are not monsters. Well, you and I certainly are not monsters. Maybe somebody is a monster hiding behind the table, growling, but no, we are not monsters. And this is a strange, and then this ordinary people argument is presented as a refutation of the idea that these perpetrators are monsters. But in actual fact, I do not know a single source that says that perpetrators, mass perpetrators, génocidaires, are monsters. There is no such source. Nobody ever said that, except in wartime propaganda. I remember when I was 6 years old and we read, among others, the Communist Daily, the Waarheid, and it said that the beastman's Kotela, the beast man, and I was 5 years old, I really meant the beast man, but that is not a very serious context. So basically, this ordinary people argument sets up a straw man. Everybody until now thought that these people were monsters, drooling at the corner of their mouth, having horns, bloodied eyes. And now we say, no, they're ordinary people, which sort of frees them from having to say what the hell ordinary people are. Well, and then the argument is ordinary people like you and me, under extraordinary circumstances, would commit extraordinary crimes. And the argument is that all of us, by a given situation, can be transformed in mass killers. And on the this is on the face of it, and even at more close inspection, there's a lot of truth in it, much more than I ever would want to realize. It is so that many people, under given conditions, commit incredible crimes. And that the situation, the current situation, does indeed bring people, force people, tempt people, convince people to commit crimes of the kind that we have seen. And this has become a very broad consensus in social science and history. Ordinary people commit extraordinary deeds under extraordinary circumstances. So much so that I think I collected some 40 or 50 titles which have ordinary people in it. But let's take Browning's book. First of all, I think Christopher Browning's book is the most significant evidence in favor of the ordinary people thesis. So I'll try my best to criticize it because it is the strongest case. But let's start out with the title, Ordinary Man. Were they all that ordinary? Let's say they were, to begin with, ordinary Germans in 1941, 1942. Well, and they were, in the vast majority, former somewhat elderly policemen. Well, German elderly policeman in 1941 is not your average world citizen. So there was already something going on. First of all, they had been listening for 12 years, been forced to listen to the most vicious and egregious, unrelenting propaganda about race, about Slavs, about Jews, about what they call gypsies. And you couldn't deny it, you couldn't escape it. They had been, one might say, brainwashed. They were just Nazified under tremendous pressure. They were in a war. Their cities were being bombed en masse by the Allied air forces. They were afraid of the Russians who were coming. So this was not just an ordinary bunch like you and me. This was rather specific historical circumstances. Secondly, what do we know about them? Almost all we know about perpetrators of mass murder, we know from police interrogations and from judicial documents long after the fact. And Browning's material is exactly that, judicial documents, police interrogations. And let me tell you, mass murderers are not at their best when they stand before their judges. What do? Well, we know. In general, they say, first of all, they've got nothing against Croats or against Serbs or against Jews or against Shiites or against Yazidi. They don't really have strong opinions and strong feelings. They're just one of those guys. And basically, you honored Mr. Judge, you got the wrong one before you. I'm just a little cog in the wheels. So they sort of take on a camouflage of insignificance. The master of this game was Eichmann and his defender, I think it was called Pistorius, who succeeded in blending in his environments and presenting himself as just a little bureaucrat who happened to be in he thought the right place at the right time, but now apparently it was the wrong place in the wrong time, and he just did what was told of him. He had nothing against Jews. On the contrary, he really liked the butcher on the corner who had been a Jewish butcher. He had nothing basically against Jews. He was, yes, he was a little bit of a Nazi. He couldn't deny it after all, but he made himself entirely insignificant. At one very meaningful moment during the Jerusalem trial, Eichmann appeared before his judges in Israel. Somebody was carrying on about how insignificant he was and how devoid of opinions. And then he couldn't bear it anymore. And he said, are you implying that I'm just a cog in the wheel? And he gave away the actual, he was a fanatic Jew hunter and a fanatic Nazi who went way beyond the call of duty. And when even Himmler thought it was time to stop in April 1945, Eichmann wanted to carry on. But he did a marvelous job of dissimulation, which was very typical for how so many of these perpetrators presented themselves before their judges. And he caught Hannah Arendt and many others completely blind-eyed. And if Hannah Arendt had only done her homework, she would have read Time Weekly, in which there was an interview with Eichmann before he was arrested. And under the name Ricardo Clemens, he was an important ex-Nazi in Argentina among his friends. And he talked for many, many hours with Wilhelm Sassen, a Dutch SS-man and reporter who had fled to Argentina and had interviewed for days Adolf Eichmann, who was undercover, whose identity was secret, but Sassen, as a fellow SS-man, could talk to him. And he had boasted that he would jump laughingly into his grave at the thought of having killed 6 million enemies of the Reich and Jews. Well, that doesn't quite sound so banal. He said, if I have only one misgiving, it is that I didn't get them all. So we had this material about Eichmann, but he did a marvelous job of self-dissimulation. So what is important about this is that the material we have about the self-presentation of perpetrators must be read with a kilo of salt, because these people, to save their ass, made themselves into insignificant little cogs in the wheel. Secondly, we must think twice about Hannah Arendt, who, even when she was confronted with the actual nature of Eichmann and many other perpetrators, refused, because she was a stubborn German Jew, refused to ever admit that she was wrong. And she coined the slogan, the banality of evil, which from this is the subtitle of her book about Eichmann in Jerusalem. I think she wanted to say the banality of evildoers, of perpetrators. They are not monsters, they're not interesting ideologues, they're just uninteresting, banal cogs in the wheel. But for reasons of rhythm, and sound, banality of evil sounds better. Banality of evil sounds better than banality of evildoers. Her subtitle is The Banality of Evil, which somehow suggests that the Holocaust would be banal. Banal means too ordinary to be interesting. Well, you can say anything you want about the Holocaust, but you cannot say it's too ordinary, it's not banal. So I'm mentioning this because part of our pop culture about genocide is ordinary man, banal, those things we know. And they are not entirely untrue, but they need a lot of comments. I think that there are some reasons why people so much insist on perpetrators being ordinary people. One reason is the just like you and me. They want to tell you that you too have a, let me say it in this, you too are part of original sin. You too are a sinner. You too are tempted by evil, or as the Dutch Reformed Church teaches, incapable of any good and tempted by all evil. So there is this profound originally sin idea in it. The second idea is that as good believers, we must not set apart one category of humankind as especially evil. We must even these perpetrators in some respect are our brethren. So these are profoundly religious ideas. And I think that they have they reverberate in this idea about perpetrators as ordinary people, just like you and me. But again, let me say, I too think that many people in extraordinary situations can be persuaded or tempted to commit extremely extraordinary misdeeds. But I object to the idea that people's personality would play no role, that this would be equally applicable to each one of us, each human. I think people are different. People are different in very many respects. And they have personalities that dispose them more or less to certain behavior. This, by the way, is standard social science. I know of no social science research that would completely discount personality and disposition in favor of the current situation. That's very unusual. So what I'm saying is standard social science. There's another remark to be made. If you talk about people's personality or disposition, you do not talk about something entirely different from situation, because after all, how do personalities develop? In early childhood and during adolescence, in relation to other people. So basically, when you talk about disposition or about personality, you're talking about interaction past, about situations forgone. So it's not very different stuff. You basically are saying people have a past, a social past, that has shaped them and has shaped their dispositions. Now, is it still work? I must have an extraordinary head shape because I have a simple 59. It's not that big. It's just large. Okay. This one is also. All right. Might be better. Yeah. Thank you. Now let us think what kind of dispositions might be relevant in the susceptibility to commit mass murder. Well, one thing is very obvious, and in the reading of the Yosifov episode, it crops up every moment. It is empathy. Some people have a feeling for others. Most people here have a feeling for others. If I fall off this stage, many of you will get up and say, "Are you okay?" And they want to get me on my feet. You would immediately feel worried about me. That's easy because it's at a very low cost. The ambulance will come in a few minutes. So it's an immediate urge, which very many people have. It's called empathy, the quality to identify the feelings other people experience. And then you have a little step over empathy, which is called sympathy. And then you feel an echo, a reverberation of another person's feelings. So if the other person cries, you are sad. If she's glad and laughs, you feel relieved and gay, cheerful. We can also simply call it compassion. What is very interesting in the Yosifov episode is that very many of the policemen of Battalion 1 feel strong compassion with children. And this is universal. If SS men break, it's almost always over a memory that has to do with children. And I think that is, they themselves say because they have siblings at home, but there's another fact. They were children themselves. And they know about the vulnerability, the helplessness of children. So this occurs time and again, children, and the compassion felt for children. So compassion, empathy, sympathy, compassion, that is one. There is a second thing. People learn to identify with other people as human beings somewhat like them. And it is typical of many perpetrators that their circle of identification is very small. It used to be the family, even the nuclear family, and they would be willing to sacrifice. They were loyal, solidarity with their father, their mother, their siblings. And later on with the gang, the guys they hang around with, and they would fight with them, they would share their beers with them. Those were people like them. And then later, and very important, their military units. So their comrades in arms, their commanders, they would be truly loyal to their commanders. They would be ready to fight and maybe even die, certainly to kill, to protect their comrades. So this is and it's a lot of social work to extend the circle of identification. I mentioned some Christian thinking about the human proclivity to evil, but another work that Christians do is to extend the circle of identification. They have an idea that all brethren and sisters in the faith are deserving of their sympathy, their compassion. They even have an idea that all God's human creatures are brothers and sisters. So it's a work this faith does to extend the circle of compassion, of identification, if you wish. But typical for perpetrators is that it tends to be very small, but many of the worst perpetrators were loyal to their comrades, obedient to their commanders, and consider that as a virtue and a truly felt emotion. And that kind of love, let's call it love, is part of the perpetrator's mentality. You have to swallow twice, but that is how it works. And the SS had on its belt, meine Ehre heißt Treue. My honor is faithfulness, loyalty. And I think many of them meant that. And then there is a third thing which you find in many perpetrators' accounts, and that is in American English, it's called agency. That is, they will tell the judge or the police interrogator, yeah, it's true, I was in Sobibor, it's right, but I didn't know what Sobibor, I had no employment. A friend of mine said, there's interesting work somewhere in Poland, and I thought, oh, maybe that's interesting, so I went there. Yeah, it smelled a bit funny, it was a bit strange, but you know, I needed a job, and so I went there, and then they asked me to do horrible things. I'm not going to be. And well, you could hardly refuse, so they told me I had to do it, so I did it. They convey a sense that they are not the actors of their own life. Now, let us look at that another time. You are not the actor of your own life either. But it is part of our modern ideology to present ourselves as if we were making our own lives. You don't. You do a little part. You try a little bit. But in their experience of life, they have basically no part in what happens to them. And they never say, well, I had to make a choice, either work in Sobibor or I couldn't pay my family or I would go to jail. So yes, I choose Sobibor, and I knew that is totally unlike the way perpetrators present themselves. Remember, they stand before their judges, so they try to minimize their responsibility, their accountability. So it's part of their camouflage, but it's also often part of their lived experience that they are no actors and makers of their own lives. And in American psychology, that is what you call the sense of agency, of being responsible for life's choices and recognizing that things that occur to you have an aspect of choice. You can always say no, even though sometimes the cost of refusing may be death. But still, it's a choice. So in these three respects, perpetrators tend to be somewhat different and certainly present themselves before their judges a bit different than most other people. Now, it's a matter of degree, a little bit more, a little bit less. We are not quite sure what is self-presentation in a trial and what is a lived disposition, but this is what you have to look at. Now, Nico Freda, who wrote a book called The Laws of the Emotions, that's a beautiful title for a book to have. You go write a book, The Laws of the Emotions, says, well, one of the sentiments that is most easily lost is a sense of compassion. If you are really in difficult situation, it's very easy to lose your empathy with other people and say, well, after all, they're stupid, they're asking for it. Yes, we shoot them, but they are hardly human. I don't have to identify with them. And of course, the constant propaganda helps to as I call it, disidentify from other people. So you don't identify anymore with another person as quite like you, but you feel that this person is maybe not even a person, is very different, is lewd or avaricious or treacherous or what have you, all these bad characteristics that you and our kind of people don't have. You can't trust them. They don't take care of their children. They're always drunk. They steal. They betray. Their food smells, etc., etc. So they become the others, and then it is easier to lose your identification with them. So in the Yosefov episode, which we listened to, obviously the Nazi work hadn't been accomplished yet, because these people, quite a few of these German policemen had trouble shooting Jews because somehow they reminded them of people of their own kind. Later on, they become other people or other creatures, I should say, that might be disposed of no matter what. The dehumanizing or disidentification. When we look at the Browning, and I said this is the most solid piece of evidence there is for the situation as the one determining factor. In this Yosefov episode with which the book begins, you can see that quite a few people on their own account, from their own personality, try to get out of this killing episode, or try to wriggle out it, lie a little bit, just make themselves unseen. So you still see people who are trying to maneuver, to do things, to make choices. Later on, this disappears, and they become totally dead drunk shooting automatons, who from the early morning to the late evening, every day, for weeks, months, years at a stretch, round up Jews in Poland and Ukraine and Belarus, march them out of the village. These are mostly rural villages, because the Jews in the Soviet Union were, in majority, were rural people. They march them out of the village. They bring them to a nearby stand of trees, a grove. They make them dig ditches. They make them undress in the snow. They line them up. They put their machine guns in place. They machine gun the entire row. These naked people fall in the ditch they had dug. And then the next row is marched in, shot, and falls in. And this goes on and on and on. They were mostly dead drunk, but still. And somehow we don't know of any resistance anymore. Browning has hardly, what he does say is some people were eager and willing. And Daniel Jonah Goldhagen talks about Hitler's willing executioners. He was a student of Browning's, who wrote a book against Browning's idea of ordinary people, and say, no, the Germans were totally eliminationist anti-Semites. So anti-Semites who not just had something against Jews, as so many Christian people in Europe had before the war, but always remember there hadn't been a Holocaust then yet. It was something different. But they were eliminationist anti-Semites, says Goldhagen, who wanted to kill all Jews. I think that is a bit too much. It's not entirely without truth, but it's too much of a generalization and exaggeration. But then such willing executioners certainly were among Browning's ordinary men, ordinary Germans, but most of them just did what they were told to, the least possible. A little bit like good, brave soldier Schwecks, you do what you got to do, but as little as possible. And then there were a number of people who were really reluctant and bothered, but still did what they were supposed to do, because there was no choice there anymore. You simply had to do it. So there are, even in Browning's book, there are shades of difference between different people. So I've come to sum up genocidaires, which is a good term for mass murderers, tend in general to have less empathy and sympathy than most other people. And what little they have, they may lose in the course of the genocidal episode. They have a low sense of agency, and they tend to have rather restricted circles of identification. But it is always a little bit less, a little bit more. And then there is one mechanism which you should look out for in turbulent times. In turbulent times, basically means there are many moments that you must choose one way or another. That because many things happen, and at many points in those times, you must either do one thing or the other thing, or either the one thing is imposed on you and then the other. Between choice and what occurs to you, it's very difficult to decipher. So if you have a little bit of a different disposition, not even all that big, there may be dozens of moments in which those disposition predisposes you a little bit to one kind of choice, an opportunistic choice, or maybe a choice of principle, a little bit of principle. Too much principle gets you killed in turbulent times, but you can always wiggle. And so I call that the vibrating sieve, in Dutch the schutzeef, in which you have pebbles, and these pebbles are on a rotating band, and then since it shakes, the big pebbles gradually in each little incident, each little movement of this rotating band, are sorted one way or another according to weight. And that is a good metaphor for what happens in very turbulent times. You're, in a way, tried time and again, and according to your personal dispositions, you may go like a light pebble or a heavy pebble, and there a slight disposition may make for a quite large separation. So the argument is that minor difference in personal disposition in turbulent times may work out in the end in rather different ways. And then the last sentence, or almost last sentence in the book, I want to read you. I think I can tell you by heart. I say, even mass murderers are persons, in many respects, different persons, different like everyone else. Okay, this is what I have to say about it. Now I'm very curious to know what you guys have to say about it.
Okay, so we open the floor for questions. Really?
Sorry?
We open the floor for questions.
Yeah, sure.
So it seems like you essentially said the banality of evil idea doesn't really work that well. Actually, there is some kind of predisposition that you can have as a person. And it seems like it's not just a predisposition you have from the environment you're in, but really you can have your own personal predisposition. Yeah. That's your Sid metaphor.
Yeah.
But
you add pre to disposition, and predisposition sounds very deterministic.
Well,
No. That's then I have either you have misheard me or I have misexpressed. Personality, disposition matters, but so does current context. we must keep these two things all the time in balance, in changing balances. Yes.
So I think my main question is rather, how do we begin to actually talk about the impact that personality disposition have? Because it seems like it's either way too obscure for us to measure, or doesn't actually have an effect. Because I mean, you can come up with counterexamples for all kinds of different personalities, dispositions. As soon as you point to maybe, a lot of people use the example of Rwandans have an incredibly obedient society.
Yeah.
And if you, I mean, you can just make a full-on society argument about that and say that there's nothing in their actual nature that disposes them. Some people try to make the argument that it is something that's like in more than just a cultural nature to be disposed to obedience, and that was a factor in the Rwandan genocide. But it seems like such an obscure thing to measure, and then also something that you can easily find counterexamples against. Why do you even use that as a measure for how perpetrators behave?
Yeah. Let me talk about the Rwandan situation. First of all, the words Hutu and Tutsi in our culture in the West are immediately translated in racial categories or ethnic categories, but they were not at all. Just to confuse you, which is in this case very helpful, you could be somebody's Tutsi and be somebody else's Hutu. The situation between Tutsis and Hutus was used by first the German and then the Belgian colonizers to create two different ethnicities. But initially, a Tutsi family, first of all, there were no individuals. The Tutsi clan was a clan who owned cattle, and Hutus were people who were agriculturalists families. And one of the oldest, this is Cain and Abel in the Bible, but one of the oldest themes in African society are the roving herders, cattle owners, who come with their cattle when the farmers have harvested, and then the cattle eats what's left, the stubble, is that the word, stubble? What is left when you harvest? Or stubble what's on your beard? No, anyway, you get the idea. And there are always conflicts, but the farmers lend cows and drink the milk which the pastoralist gives them, and the pastoralists use the harvested land to graze their cattle. So this is a very subtle, complicated. Now, if a cattle owner could lend his cow to a Hutu farmer who would use the milk but be indebted to the Hutu. So this is totally different from our ideas of ethnicity. It is a relation of a lender to a borrower, and of a somewhat more prestigious person to a somewhat less prestigious. So you could be, I'm his Hutu, basically meant I have borrowed a cow from him, drunk all the milk, and now I'm indebted to him. But it is true that the Tutsis also were more closely connected to the courtly circles. So when the Germans came, they had this idea of the Dutch of European nobility, and they said to the Tutsis, so you are the noblemen, the superior court people. And the Tutsis said, of course, yes, that's what we are. Great. And then the Belgians came and were very modern and introduced persoonsbewijzen, IDs with a photograph. And every Rwandan and Burundian could choose whether he was a Tutsi or a Hutu, almost existentialist, very modern. You could choose your identity. Yeah? But you had to have one. And from that moment on, you had an idea which said who you were. And so these ideas about Hutu and Tutsi became more and more redefined through European eyes, but still Hutus and Tutsis lived together with one another, and usually it was a joking relationship. So you would make jokes about Tutsis, the way we do with Belgians. We think the Belgians are dumb, and they think we are scroungy. We like money. And we make jokes about how dumb the Belgians are. The Belgians make jokes about how we are materialistic. That doesn't mean a thing. Or no, it means all sorts of things, sorry. But basically this Hutu-Tutsi thing was transformed already in the 50s into a sort of ethnic Croat-Serb thing. And why it became so toxic, that's a long story, and I can't say I entirely understand it. But it brings us to another theme about these in the Hutu-Tutsi. This was not a very strongly organized. It was not like Police Battalion 101. You were rounded up. There were these intra-Hamwe gangs, but you could join them and sort of leave them. It was the state was present and encouraged the genocide, but it very much depended on whether you felt like it. And this is one of the most simple mechanisms which is almost always overlooked. How much compulsion was there for you to join the ranks of the killers? You could see in Josefov, there was a lot of compulsion and pressure to kill with the killers. You were drafted, you almost had no way out. But for example, in Rwanda, it was a matter of joining a gang and going. And there was a lot of joking. They would put on banana skirts and paint themselves and drink. It was extremely cruel and I would say hysterical, festive, unorganized, but you could also just make yourself unseen and get the hell out of there. So there is a lot of voluntary aspect to the Rwanda killings.
I slightly disagree that people felt that they could kind of step out.
Yeah.
I kind of disagree that people felt they could step out of it. That a lot of the sources talking about this speak about the truth. I mean, the video that Eric put up, the fact that moderate Hutus were part of the victims. As soon as you were seen as moderate and you were criticizing the genocide and the plans for the genocide, you were put into the category of people who were doing genocide. So there really wasn't a lot of ability to step aside. And I think this is actually really what I'm questioning is a lot of people say there's some kind of thing that people have that's not just, oh, I'm being coerced because there's a narrative, I'm being coerced because I don't want to be part of this group that's supposed to be genocide. In fact, it seems like you're saying there's something else that people use to decide to engage in genocide. And I'm interested in that because it seems, I'm interested in that.
No. Yeah, per definition, no one on his own can, you can become a killer in a school. But genocide, per definition, you don't do that on your own. There's lots of people around you, but it's very important that some people join the gang and some people just stay home. And there was not too much, they were simply not organized enough, so you don't see the people who stay home. Some people say, I want to go to this fight and to all the excitement. And their mother would say, no, you stay here, chak, chak, chak. So it is, and their personality dispositions play a much larger role than, for example, in the Yosefov episode, which was very well organized, very drafted. It was very difficult to get out of it. Whereas, for example, in pogroms, rather spontaneous mass phenomena, we talked last time about mega pogroms. There's much more of a voluntary element. But understand me, I'm always talking about more or less. You cannot say that the Rwanda genocide was voluntary and the German genocide was compulsory. No, these are shades and nuances. But the more it is voluntary, the more personality plays a part. And we don't know who stays home and says, this is not for me. And who is rather ashamed and embarrassed the next day that he wasn't part of all the excitement and that he was a sissy and a coward, a scheisskerl, as the Weichling.
Can I ask which
Yes.
personal dispositions like made people sense to join in that violence?
Could you say the question again?
Which personal dispositions make people make them join?
Yeah. Underdeveloped empathy, little empathy with the suffering of others. Feeling that, few people say, I'm going to kill tomorrow. I really feel like it. Most people just happen to be carried away with their friends or with their battalion, and they'll say, yeah, it just occurred to me. That is the low sense of agency. And a strong feeling that the other people are unlike pebbles, and they end up, after all the shaking of those turbulent times, on one side, camp guards and killers, and that's it. But these are metaphors, although not entirely.
To stay in the metaphor for a second,
yeah.
Isn't the framework you have outlined not only a rotating sieve to, by steps, separate those heavy pebbles out, but also to create them in the first place?
Create them.
Yeah, to create them, because the longer with each cycle of separation, someone remains in the framework of ideology and framework.
Yeah.
And I would argue that.
No, that's a good point. This is, if we stick to the metaphor, this is a rotating sieve that can make heavy pebbles heavier.
Yeah.
Now we are beyond that's a very nice point. We're beyond you got it? And we have this sieve, which every event which happens in turbulent times sort of gives a little push to people who tend to be inclined to join a murderous gang, a little push that way. But our interrogator, as I'm calling him now, says, yes, but this sieve makes heavy pebbles a little heavier, because there you are, say, part of the Nazi party. Next time you find yourself among the street gangs of the SA, then you find yourself having destroyed the Jewish shop, etc., etc. So as the sieve keeps vibrating, you become heavier and heavier. That's a very nice addition to the idea. Yes, sure.
Yeah, thanks, Prof. I won't say entertaining because it's not a nice book. What I hear you say is, on the one hand, it's a disciplinary process.
Yes.
To do those psychological analysis, personality. I hear an echo of Dorner already, and the social issues, projects, different circumstances. I want to go a little bit in the middle here.
Yeah.
You mentioned a little bit with the idea of the field.
Yeah.
So these are the soldiers who construct or who do this killing. And there's quite a lot of research actually on veterans.
Yeah.
Who do that. And actually what I also hear a little bit, they learn.
Yes.
So this is learning component.
Yeah.
And what you could also add, this idea, you said it was, it is a kind of love in the peer group. Well, I don't know, because what you often also see in these testimonies is that they hate one another. So there's a lot of friction there as well. But at the end, you set up your book, you call persons.
Yes.
So this personhood.
Yes.
And that is what they create in these groups of soldiers who also expect one another to kill and so gain person.
Yes.
And now what comes in with the last one is that in the whole statement.
Yes.
And they didn't do a little bit absent because this
allow me, in the last lesson we talked very much about states and about the large picture.
If you want to, I think,
Yeah.
you want to understand or to, let's say, to
Yeah.
interpret how perpetrators become perpetrators.
Yes.
And then, because all these mechanisms of how soldiers learn to kill, it's ancient. It goes back to the Greeks.
Yeah.
And what is so interesting is that it is known. So states, in the formation of armies, they use all these kind of mechanisms in order to form killers that they need.
Yes. Yes.
So I think that's, I would go a little bit further into these mechanisms.
Mhm.
In how, actually also, how a military unit functions when all these young men come together, very often from different parts, some farmers, some urbanites, and they must be forged into a unit.
Yeah.
So then the personality must be broken,
Mhm.
the military teams.
Yeah.
So, and in the forging of the new personality, I think you may find perpetrators you are looking for.
Yeah. Well, so here the argument is you must also look carefully to the, let me say, organized military settings, because that's what we're not talking about. For example, the making of an SS man has every trait of what there was a consciously designed course to make an SS. For example, SS men were made to kill their own dogs which they had helped to train, to make him heartless. And dogs were almost human, and some human beings were lower than dogs in the SS mentality. And so you're absolutely right. In the police battalion 101, there was hardly time to train them to become killers. These were mainly, German policemen who were a little bit elderly and who had not yet been drafted. Well, almost everybody had already been drafted. So they were a bit schlemiel. They were also horrible killers, but
Someone volunteered to adjust the microphone, maybe someone who participated in TEDx or something.
Anybody's better at this than the two of us.
I'm very bad at that.
Someone who can do it for the rest of our session, so that it doesn't slip.
We want to try it. Try it if you can.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, it doesn't, I'm just giving you an example. And I want you to hold this microphone close to your mouth for the sake of us, but also for the sake of the recording.
Go ahead. You want me to take off my glass?
Very well on the recording part, I know, from the first time.
No, go ahead.
This way, the audience can also hear you, okay? Any other questions? This way.
Yes, fine.
Okay.
You can always start formulating a question.
Yeah, no.
I don't know if it's turned on.
On this side.
So this side, it's this, I think it's. This is a weird.
No, I have to think about Star Wars.
So I don't think it'll come down.
Okay.
Is that working better?
Well, for the time being, it is. Thanks. Thank you. Okay.
Abram, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
So it's a bit unusual, but Star Wars, right? And there was this discussion about Star Wars, particularly about the prequel on Star Wars, with George Lucas, who made the films, because he has certain moments in the pictures where he, for example, has Master Yoda. Master Yoda decides not to train Anakin Skywalker because he's too old, he argues. And one of the questions that was asked to George Lucas was to the meaning of this kind of decision in the film that Yoda says, because it was not functional to the film. They find that in the end, it ends up training.
This cannot be a question because I've never seen Star Wars. Don't tell anyone. No, I've never seen Star Wars.
Do you believe that there is a moment, because George Lucas answers that he believes that there is a moment where kids are so small that if they are trained appropriately, disposition doesn't matter yet, but they will choose the way they are trained to choose, if they're small enough.
Well, you showed yourself this ISIS episode in which a small child is trained at 5 years to become an executioner. Well, there are a lot of those child soldiers, and we know by now a whole lot about them because they, well, apparently it is a huge destruction. These children are completely confused and stunted once they have been transposed from their soldier environment to the United Nations caring environment. But it is a disaster. It is like children who have been abused in other ways. As far as we know, these children are very, very, very strongly damaged.
So you would argue that socialization at that level matters more than disposition, and that the children cannot resist a socialization that is not okay.
I would call a socializing process the process in which dispositions are made. And so these children now have a certain contradictory, they have not had motherly care, they have had no adults who would be protective. It is a total disaster. But maybe they would have functioned well if they had remained in their soldierly environment. God knows what would have become of them. They have also been transposed to a wholly different environment, which for children may be a very confusing experience. But the poor little monsters, well, there's not much which I can say about them. Yeah.
How would you compare SS soldiers who claim they never wanted to kill but killed by compulsion or by the thing that they have no choice to, for example, Jews in the camps who had to kill or bury other Jews and were basically used as tools in the perpetrators' killings? How would you compare those two types of, I don't want to say perpetrators for both of them, but...
I see. Well, if I were the interrogator of an SS man, wonderful fantasy, I would not believe that there was no moment of choice. For example, the choice for the camp guards was to be, if they refused, was to be sent to the Eastern Front, which was a normal fate for an SS man. Many soldiers had deep contempt for camp guards. That was not a soldierly occupation. So there was an element of choice even for the SS camp guards. And there is an anecdote which always impressed me very much. An SS man who had served at the Eastern Front comes to Auschwitz and is made to be a camp guard. And he looks around and he says, "This is not a place where a son of my mother ought to be. I refuse." And I've always been intrigued, a son of my mother. He could have said I, but he said a son of, as if that was a higher authority, even higher than the Nazi leadership, his mother. It's also very moving and it is very courageous, but it still was not I. There is a roundabout. So I think SSs who would have denied the element of choice were simply liars trying to cover. About people who were involved, like capos, or it's too sad to talk about, there was no choice. The choice was death or be a accomplice of the, and I feel that I should not sit in judgment over those people. I should remain silent. But other people can talk about it. It's, yeah. Please.
I'm deeply impressed by your findings, and especially the confidence you seem to have in them. But I'm also, I'm deeply confused because I wonder how can you come to such generalizations about perpetrators And I wonder what the methods are. Are you looking at individual cases, or can you make some sort of statistics? I would not know how about many perpetrators, because there were so many. And then say, okay, all of them that came from this group of characteristics in the beginning developed to be something like this.
Yeah.
Or what are methods in this?
Oof. Hey, did I come over as confident?
Well, kind of, because you mentioned, for example, those factors. Okay, I think that, but it's also not all of it.
No.
And then I'm like, okay, I was not really, okay, maybe full time, I really don't know what to say.
Yeah.
But you have like your own idea of what it is.
Yeah, well, what I try to convey constantly is that we know very little because we could not observe, participate, and interview those people where they were at their job. We know them from a very complicated performance where they play chameleon. That is what we know. And then it is a very emotional terrain where people, in order to look at it, need to do all sorts of, take positions, deal with their feelings, have very strong opinions, often influenced by religion and by politics. I have no special method. There are very few, there is, Michael Mann did a research of 1,500 perpetrators and found, not surprisingly, that many of them were either violence specialists, that is policemen, military people, and violent criminals. They were predisposed, you could say. But we have the beautiful historical research by Browning, and there are more sources, but it still is very difficult. And the genocidal situations are so different. Rwanda is so different from say, the Nazi Holocaust, which remains rather standalone incidents. I cannot say incident, episode. So I try to convey all the doubts and uncertainties of whatever I say. I try to convey that it's always a matter of a little bit less and a little bit more. But I have a strong opinion that one should approach mass murderers as persons, just like you and me in this sense, except very different from one another and from everybody else. So we have I do not think that it is sufficient to completely explain them from the current situation, although I admit that that is very important. So what we really are doing is the preliminaries of serious scientific research because it is so difficult. But we're trying to sort out arguments and see what evidence we can look critically at the evidence. We're not any further than that. And there was somewhere somebody was intimating that there might also be a tendency to kill, and there might be a pleasure or even an elation, an ecstasy in killing. That is also part of it, and that is the hardest to discuss because I've never had the pleasure, and I probably won't ever get it. And it is very shameful. That is, there are fascist fantasizers who, when they feel very safe, will admit that they were in ecstasy killing. The next moment, they might maybe also in mourning about what they did. But such a thing apparently exists. And it may be like driving very fast on the wrong side of the road in a car, and the next moment, either you're dead or you think, Jesus, I was an idiot. But here, the stakes are much higher. Yeah.
So based on the answer you just gave, actually, I'm still confused as to.
So am I.
I'm confused as to why you have this idea of some disposition that people can have that makes them in this case, more likely to feel that.
Yes.
So why, it feels to me as though kind of what's being said is that no one in this room would have that pleasure, would be in a situation we could do that because people simply won't have.
Yeah, the pleasure is not, maybe not entirely right, but let's just call it ecstasy.
Yeah, but it feels as though throughout your lecture you were suggesting that there are types of people who simply won't feel that way when put in a situation where others feel that way.
Well, we're not talking about the ecstasy of killing. Yes. Yeah. Well, this is really a sensitive subject, and very few people who have experienced it honestly report about it, and we don't know too much about it. It's part of romantic literature that is a little bit idealized. I know there is one case of an SS man who, when he was machine gunning people, experienced what he himself reported as some lustful experience. And he was, as good German Lutheran boy, very upset by it and went to his superiors to say, look, I cannot go on with this because I experience feelings that do not belong there. Because so we don't really know, but ecstasy in killing exists, but how and what and how people feel the next day, I don't know.
But then, given that we know so little about it, why do you, for example, seem to fairly strongly reject the idea that the whole idea of the banality of evil, the idea that it really is just ordinary people and they're put in a situation in which they're made to feel that way? Because it really feels like throughout the lecture you were positing there is some disposition that's
specific to all kinds. Yeah. And no. There is.
Why how come put that forward so confidently?
Well, because people are not without a past, which is another way of saying people have a personality. They're not infinitely moldable. A famous sociologist, Dennis H. Wrong, called it the over-socialized conception of man. And he expressly says people are not just social in the present situation, they have a past, they have been, and you must realize almost all these nice Catholic little intra-Hamwe killers had gone to communion, had learned that you shall not kill. All those kind Lutheran German schoolboys had learned that you have to be a good Christian, etc., etc. And yes, the Jews killed Jesus Christ, but Jesus was a Jew. So they had learned things. They were not without a memory. And there were conflicts, and these conflicts had to be somehow resolved or repressed. And then we come, because I only deal in riddles. The one great riddle is, after the war, among these hundreds of thousands of perpetrators, because they were that many, I think it was Baron and Czerny did a research among German social workers, therapists, and pastoral workers. Who of them had ever had a case of an ex-perpetrator who had come for psychic, mental, moral support to one of these helpers? None of the 800 people who had been questioned by Czerny and Baron mentioned a single case except one pastor who talked to a perpetrator on his deathbed and who made full confession. This is a huge riddle, because nowadays in the United States, people who have been on a tour of duty for 3 months get PTSD, post-traumatic disorder, and they are upset about things that would make a German SS killer laugh. So why is it? Why in South Africa, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the perpetrators from the ANC and the African Secret Service were in tears, had nightmares, were crying? One thing is they were on both sides. This is unique. Why? I have a formula which is looks like an answer. I'm not sure it is. I think that there is as much space to realize and express your feelings as there is social space to communicate them. If you live in a country where there is no patience, no space to say, we killed, I'm just a Dutch military and we shot people in the Indonesian village, that happened too. If there is no place where you can talk about that without being punished or shamed or whatever, then there may not be space to experience it in yourself. And in post-German society, there was no such space. In post-Indonesian independence war in the Netherlands, there was no such space. So what there was, and which is very important, perpetrators met one another in a kneipe, in a pub, and they would be drinking. But they would not, as far as we know, talk about what happens. So the only way to understand what happened in South Africa was that a space was created for it. And you could cry and you could own up to nightmares. We know that many German perpetrators in their families kept it a secret. It was very important for the children not to know. But I think that the wives always knew. But they didn't talk about it. But it remains, where did all this go? Were there no conflicts? Were there no memories? I can't believe that. What scientific evidence do I have that things may just disappear in thin air? None. I just don't believe it. It must be somewhere.
I still don't fully understand how that supports the idea that there's some disposition that people have. For example, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, there were definitely perpetrators who didn't cry. I mean, there's Eugene de Kock, his testimony is one of the more famous ones, and he's not crying at all. He's saying point blank a number of atrocities that he committed. And part of the reason is that's just practical for him. Similarly, lots of ANC perpetrators who went on trial didn't cry at all and didn't show a lot of remorse, or showed remorse because it was one of the criteria for getting amnesty in the first place. That's all just practical. I don't see how that says anything about a disposition they have to react a certain way, to feel a certain way about the acts they're committing. It really.
Well, apparently they have different dispositions.
But do they all have different dispositions that are personal to them, or is it just the kind of the climate they're in? The ANC, it would be a very bad idea, if seeing that they wanted to then rule the country afterwards, to admit to a lot of crimes and to a lot of violent crimes and atrocities, and a lot of abuses as well. It would just be a very bad idea. That's not a personal disposition any of the individuals had, but rather something that has to do with the society they were building. In that sense, it still doesn't feel like a disposition. It feels entirely like something that's just
calculation. So
I don't fully understand how those examples support an idea of a disposition individuals can have, as opposed to just the fact that anyone can step into the role of violence and commit violence. It doesn't matter who they are. All that matters is the situation that kind of creates a culture.
Well, and the question is, why do some people do it and some people don't? That remains the open question, unless they are all forced to. But even in the Yosefov situation, some people didn't, or some people found it very difficult. For me, the secret is, how come if you're brought up like a good German Catholic Boy Scout or a good German Lutheran Boy Scout with your usual dose of good old German anti-Semitism, and how does this past somehow fall away once you become a obedient and correct SS man? Where does it go? I mean, I might be a chemist and look at a chemical reaction and say, where did some of the ingredients go? They must be there. Call it the law of the conservation of mental energy.
Can I ask again a question, Abram?
Yes.
Connected to what Ila was saying just now, do you feel that the way we use disposition is to take into account the fact that some individuals are more susceptible to conditioning,
yes,
and others are less?
For example?
And just because now we are speaking, of course, of the past, perpetrators, and so on and so forth, but connecting to the argument of my colleague from the anthropology department that pointed to the military, that pointed to how military system works. You know, and I don't know if you agree with me, but I would like really strongly to have your opinion as an expert. Do you feel that we have, because we tend to think that we've come a long way, and I had soldiers from the Dutch army, as you say, when created that space for communication, saying, yeah, you know, I was in Abu Ghraib prison and I was a doctor there, and I had to keep people alive during interrogation. And I went to my superior and I said, this is not okay. So they knew that it was not okay. And the superior said, we are the allies of the Americans. We are doing what we're told. And if you don't do what you're told, you're going to be replaced. Someone else is going to do your job, and you can go back to the Netherlands and you're going to be demoted. And they said, well, okay, so I'm going to do what I have to do. Yeah. And that's the thing. Yeah. So should we kind of, while we are analyzing these things of the past, also keep, you know, a little bit look on the present in the way we train soldiers, in the way we actually, I was at West Point where they said, yeah, we have to deconstruct the person that comes into West Point and see if we can rebuild him up from the ground as a good soldier, which sounds to me like what we were saying about the SS. Yeah. And all this kind of stuff. And the interactions with NATO, they're always saying, yeah, you know, we can't say no to the politician. We can't make them aware that certain things are not okay or are not done or are not in line with, because we are just a tool. Mm-hmm. And they're very close to Vizia. Okay. So what do you think about this? Do we learn something for the future? Are we not learning anything? Are these things going to come back because we haven't learned anything? What's your point here?
Well, right at this moment, Russians who enter Ukrainian cities commit horrendous crimes, and when they leave once again, so I'm hesitate to say that I hope so, and I a little bit believe it, that we learn something, but if we do, it goes very slowly, and but right, and look, the Ukrainians are not telling us what they're doing. I don't know what they do, but let's be aware that they're certainly not going to tell us, because they are the good guys in this game, and so we don't know. God knows what's coming. And let's also, you know, I'm Dutch, many of you are not, but this isn't, I remind you, this happens to be the Netherlands. The Dutch committed a number of horrendous crimes in the late 40s in Indonesia, and we managed to keep silent about it for almost 70 years. Every once in a while there was a little eruption, and then people went to sleep again. And now that there is much more interest in the dark side of colonialism, it comes out that we committed a genocide in the Clove Islands, in Banda. I didn't know, honestly. Habe ich nicht gewusst. I should have known, because after all, and that I knew about the Aceh War, of course, which was a very asymmetric war. So yes, what can I say? It happens quite, well, does it happen quite often? No, because most of the time it is relative peace in the world or in a society, but there are episodes of war and extreme repression, and then these things happen, yes.
Thank you. might be, so this is a suggestion I haven't thought about it extremely long, but might it be that a large number of the confusions we're facing in these questions arise from the incorrect assumption that we cannot feel extremely contrary things at the same time. So, for example, it seems to me that throughout the previous discussion over the last 1.5 hours, we have tacitly assumed that, for example, guilt and ecstasy in killing are almost exclusionary.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe we don't want to make that assumption, similar to how we seem to have assumed that people with a propensity for a lack of agency cannot at the same time be extremely fervent supporters of something or have extremely high moral values. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, no, I have a keen sense of the contradictions that live within one breast. I would have that if I were Dutch Reformed, which I'm not, but I am a former psychoanalyst, and then you develop the same sense, but not these different tendencies, feelings, sentiments, opinion that live in one breast. It is very difficult to handle them consciously all at the same time. So you tend to push away some of those. And there again, we are in an anathema, because then you call that repression and it becomes unconscious. But I'm not quite sure after 50 years or so that I know what those words mean. One of the really difficult things in social science and in psychology is well, we all know that people are not fully aware of everything that goes on inside of them, but how they manage to not be fully aware, to not think what they think, to not feel what they feel, and to feel what they do not feel, that is still very, very difficult.
Tendency that
Yeah.
when there are clashes of emotions,
but
this tendency that when there are clashes of emotions,
what of emotions?
Clashes, contradictions.
Oh, clashes. Yes.
The tendency that in that situation, that the contradicting emotions are sometimes, or even maybe as a trend, I don't know it exactly, suppressed altogether, might well be an explanation for why you find soldiers in the aftermath of wars being apparently having forgotten everything that happened. Which is totally not a new theory. But the question I'm asking here is why are you presenting this as a confusion, right? Because I don't know, to me, sure, this might not be the right answer, but it is one working model, and I would like to ask what you think is wrong with it. Or
there's nothing wrong with it, but we don't quite know how we accomplish it. For example, to have been, say, in a war and not think back of it in the subsequent 20 years, how is that done? I myself have lived through 2 group episodes in which there was an elephant in the room, which the whole group managed not to see and not to talk about. And I have very carefully reconstructed these 2 cases of group repression, and also what happens during late hours at parties when somebody got drunk and suddenly said the truth. And then it was, I said, yes, that's true. I laughed. And then things went on, and it hadn't sunk in. So there is one book about this by Jolande Withuis, who studied the Vrouwen van Ravensbrück. Those were very courageous, resistant women who were locked up in the concentration camp Ravensbrück, which was horrible. And they went through terrible experiences. And then they were liberated. They were all very, either communist or very left. They were liberated by the great patriotic army, the Stalin soldiers, who came to liberate them and then raped them. Talking about having to deal with different things. And they remained a very tight group of women after the war for dozens of years. But this had not happened. It was never discussed. The Great Red Army remained the Great Red Army. Father Stalin remained the great liberator. But many of them had these secrets. And Yolande Withuis succeeded in, well, she studied them and then she found out about the secret, she talked about it. And it is a study in which what you call group repression. So every of those women knew it and somehow they were overcome. This is how I describe it, by a certain sleepiness. So when people would mention that, it wasn't mentioned or they thought about something else. These little incidents occur also in many memories of children of perpetrators who suddenly say something and embarrass the whole family. It's a book. There is the grandfather is a SS man, and there is a great anniversary of the family. Of course, nobody talks about this. And the 4-year-old goes to the attic and finds this SS helmet. And on this anniversary, comes down with an SS helmet, and everybody freezes. And then the mother says, "Come, let's have coffee and cake." And it hasn't happened. So we have to look at how this is done. Okay, one wonders which would be the one unspeakable thing in this room. Yeah.
Are there any more questions?
Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this, further about this compartmentalization.
Yes.
Because, you had this, this loss of empathy.
Yes.
Yeah, grandfathers.
Yeah.
Who, I also remember you wrote about it, who have lost their empathy with victims, but then, 1 hour later have their little baby on the telephone.
Yes.
They have all the empathy and love for the family.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, I would be glad to. Compartmentalization is the key word. And in the last lecture, we talked about it at a societal level, the increasing separation of the people of the regime's people and the target people, and how they were more and more separated. And then we discussed how that also is a psychological process. And I mentioned how a good German felt a vitale Abkehr, a vital disgust in the presence of homosexuals, which also signified that he was not homosexual because he felt his hair stand on end. So he was a healthy German. And then this was transposed to Jews. A real good Aryan should feel a physical disgust of Jews, showing that he was a real Aryan. So there was an interest in having this physical. So what I mean is that political opinions can become literally a gut feeling. And the compartmentalizing process is an institutional process and a political and ideological process, but it's also you don't want to be seen with these people. You're embarrassed when you find yourself, I don't want these people on my birthday. You're physically embarrassed when you're seen in their company, and also how it sort of creates a compartment within your own self. I like to think that there is not a very neat separation between what we call a self or a person, micro-sociological interaction, institutional separations, and a regime which creates compartments of people being persecuted and people being protected. And compartmentalization is a word which Anna Freud, Freud's daughter, used to characterize one particular process of repression in which certain psychological let's say experiences, feelings, sentiments are relegated to one part of the personality. And the door can sometimes be opened, but most of the time it remains shut. And that could be, say, for an assessment, tenderness. And hopefully he had experienced tenderness from his mother or elderly brother, and it must be denied because it makes you a sissy and maybe even a homosexual. You must be tough, you must be harsh. So just that's, yeah. Okay. Do you have a question in your mind? Yeah. I'll let you off the hook. I'm not going to. Well, I just wondered if you had a question.
No, I just enjoy.
Okay. Most of you have questions, but for some reason you feel they're not ripe yet to be verbalized, but they're somewhere there.
Okay, are there any other questions? Otherwise, I would say have a good evening. Yes, the meeting is adjourned. And I see you all tomorrow, don't I?